The feeling of willingly move crowds is so thrilling. Even Prince Charles is willing to pay shillings.
Hello, world, and welcome to another episode of Songs in the Key of G with your host, me, Mark G. Tonight we're going to switch it up a little bit. Typically, we profile a hip-hop song. Tonight we're going to profile a hip-hop artist. Tonight we pay homage to an artist at a pretty special time in his life. He recently had a 50th birthday. He dropped a book about his life, of which you see I have my copy and my commemorative t-shirt. He put out a new song, and he also dropped a remix album of some classic material. Of course, I'm talking about hip-hop legend and Chicago Native E.C, aka E.C. Illa. And it would be impossible to talk about E.C. Illa without talking about the city of Chicago. My home for the last 26 years. E.C. grew up in Chicago's uptown neighborhood, surrounded by the gangs and street culture of the early 80s in Chicago. In fact, these would be themes that would be prevalent throughout his music, and in my opinion, I believe he wrote the definitive song about Chicago gangs in his song What You Be About, which to me was groundbreaking in its subject matter and also its execution. As I mentioned, E.C. recently turned 50. Now, this summer I'll be 54, so I'm a little bit ahead of him chronologically, but that puts us pretty much in the same hip-hop generation. Now, there's a lot of talk amongst hip-hop heads about the golden era, and a lot of times when they're talking about the golden era, they're talking about the 90s. And the 90s definitely had amazing hip-hop. The hip-hop we're talking about in this video was made in the 90s. However, if you were to talk to EC or myself or anyone from our generation, when we talk about the hip-hop golden era, we're talking about the 80s. We're talking about when it was all underground. Now, in 1988, Eazy-E drops Easy Does It, and NWA comes out with Straight Outta Compton. And you could see almost overnight, hip-hop became fairly one-dimensional. You would be asked, if you were a hip-hop head, you would be asked, hey, what kind of hip-hop do you like? Do you like underground hip-hop or do you like gangster rap? And it's like, I like hip-hop, right? And from where I come from in the art form, it was all underground. Not even recognized by the Grammys. I haven't watched the Grammys since Herbie Hancock won, and I think it was 84. Chuck D, Trick or Chicken Miami, Terminator X Packs the Jam. Who gives a fuck about a goddamn Grammy? And then when Dre dropped The Chronic in 92, the sound of the production changed drastically. Those were great tracks, and The Chronic is a great album, but I just like something different. I like rough beats and relatable rhymes and realness. We tend to romanticize the 90s a little bit, but the stuff that was hitting was not the memorable music that you think of when it comes to the 90s. It was things that were much more packaged and commercialized. So the great hip hop that came out of that era was very much a reaction to that. I ain't buying no tapes no more. All they got is phony hip hop in the store. But for all those who still adore, EC comes with the real hardcore. It was a reaction to all of the whackness that was out there. I first became acquainted with EC's music when I was in college. I was laying on the couch in 1995, close to 96, smoking weed, watching Rap City, and basically just trying to stay up on what was coming out. And all of a sudden, the On Ill video came on, and it was so grimy and so hip-hop that I immediately sat up and was like, wow, this is crazy. And then I was like, wait a minute, I think they're in Chicago. Now seeing B-boys and graph and hearing these rough MPC beats with real lyricism over them, I was like, wow, they're doing that in Chicago? Now I'm down at Indiana University. I was making beats at the time and I was getting ready to graduate, and I was trying to figure out where was I going to end up where I could make some hip hop music that I like and work with some artists that are of a like mindset. And, from where I was, I'm old and I'm East Coast influenced. I think the only place for a guy like me is New York. I was just like, wow, I can't believe Chicago's doing it like this. And it was so pure and so hip hop that I was just like, sign me up. And then he says, E.C. Ill Cracker, featherweight champ. And I was like, oh my God, he's a white dude. As I've mentioned in other videos, my hip hop journey started in 1979. I started as a b-boy. I learned how to DJ from there, and I ended up making beats. And hip hop white boys were rare, and they were faced with a lot of skepticism. So you were constantly having to show and prove, and you always loved to see another white dude that was doing it right. As Lord Jamar of Brand Nubians said, white people are guests in the house of hip hop. And, I don't really take that as an insult. I know he probably didn't mean it as a compliment, but I don't really take that as an insult. I think that's true. This is an art form that was created by black and brown people, and all are welcome, but you got to have skills. So I always kind of love to see a dope white boy planting a flag for dope white boys. Like when House of Pain said, call me the corn-fed, peckerwood, redneck cracker, white bread shit kicking Irish beat jacker. You just like to see dope white boys representing in a real hip hop way, and that was EC to the core. Another dope thing is that EC would include references in lines that you couldn't possibly understand unless you knew about making beats. It really is amazing the things that you can do with 15 seconds of sample time and a 16 levels button, add in some dope lyrics and fresh cutting. Now, EC worked on the MPC 60. I had to wait a little longer for my nice gear. My first Akai was the MPC 2000, but they operate very much the same. And the 16 levels button could take the sample and assign it to all 16 pads at a different note so you could play out melody with the sample. And on EC's production, you can hear that a lot. He's always got a dope bass line. Producers, if you make beats and you don't add a bass line or augment the one that's in there, I think you're missing an opportunity. EC always had rumbling bass, and a lot of times got the melody from his bass line, and the samples were kind of just peppered throughout to add atmosphere. So I really, really liked his style of production. Now, at the time I mentioned, I'm in college. I hear On Ill, and I go crazy. And I want to get it, but obviously back then you had to go to the record store and actually put your hands on a physical copy. And things that were that underground sometimes were not stocked in the store. And this was the case with Illa LP, so I went to the Big Book. And again, folks from my generation know about the Big Book. It was a book this thick, and it had all the information of the albums that were out, even the ones that weren't in the store. So I heard back from Trax Records, which at the time was my home base in Bloomington, Indiana. My special order had arrived, and I could come down and pick it up. At the time, my friend and I were doing a mix show on the community radio station, and I immediately put On Ill, Mating Ritual, Trilogy, and What You Be About in major rotation. I fell in love with Illa LP. To me, there's not one skip on the album. You can play it straight through. I love the MCing, and I love the production. Now, it's easy to talk about EC as an MC because he's great, but I think a lot of times people don't talk enough about his production, and I really, really love his production. Collaborating with his crew, the Ill State Assassins, they just present the most Chicago aesthetic that you can possibly imagine. Being from Indiana, some of it I understood at the time, like I reach from the north to the south like Lakeshore Drive, and some of the more obvious Chicago references. But then some of that aesthetic had to kind of grow on me as I moved to Chicago and lived in Chicago, like a line like rolling deep like the hoods in the Puerto Rican Day Parade. I didn't really know what that meant until I lived at Fullerton and Sawyer. There was so much of his music that as I lived in Chicago really kind of made me appreciate it even more. EC had a complete hip-hop aesthetic, absolutely understanding the fundamentals and the principles of hip-hop, even the way he did his routines, rock to the beat like this, rock to the beat like this. I mean, you can almost see the b-boy top rocking to that. It was beautiful. But EC also had a very, very credible street side. He had a keen understanding of the street life and told very vivid stories about gang culture. So at this point, you probably understand that Illa LP is pretty influential to me. But then I was able to kind of reverse engineer, now that I was familiar with the artist, and look at some of his earlier releases. Illa LP was actually his fourth release. He had the Invisible Man EP, and then he had Ill State of Mind EP, but the third one, I think, might be my favorite EC, and that is Live from the Ill. When I heard this album, I just lost my mind. The production was so great. This was the first album that EC ever produced on his own. Prior to that, he was part of a production trio with DJ Sean and Demo. I always love the opening line. I'm fucking it up like you never seen, making more moves than Ben Vereen. Now, if you got that Ben Vereen reference with no explanation, please remember to schedule your colonoscopy. Now, 1994 is a year that many people point to as a really great year in hip hop. There was the great Biggie release, there was a Gang Starr release, there was Nas, Illmatic. Several great albums came out in 94. I rank Live from the Ill, which came out in 94 as well, right up there. I think it's a classic album. I love the lyrics, of course, because EC's always spitting, but the production, I think, is great. It reminds me of almost the Beat Nuts a little bit. But it just has that rawness, I just love it. To me, that album is a masterpiece. Another one that I don't skip anything. I love Ill Is. Great song. That beat is one of my favorite beats of all time. I really love it, Don't Stop, featuring K-Tone of D to the S on the hook. EC considers himself retired these days, but he's had a prolific career. He's had 11 album releases, 14 other special releases, including rarities and instrumental projects, and he was the featured artist on at least 37 other songs. He's had quite a run. One thing I get from EC is he always has been and he always will be okay. He shows a keen business sense, and even in the era of the gatekeepers, found a way to get his independent videos shown on Rap City. There were hip-hop acts who were pretty well established that couldn't do that. But even more admirable, EC's a guy who feels like he can do anything. Of course, he made groundbreaking hip-hop albums, but he also made a movie that he wrote and directed. At one time, he worked with the legendary Traxxter's label Seawall, not as an artist, but as an executive. It seems like anything he puts his mind to, he succeeds at, including owning one of Chicago's dopest niche hip-hop record stores, The Tip. Those are just some of the accomplishments of EC's past, but he's got a lot to celebrate about the present. So this year, he put out this book, Fat Laces and Throwing Stars. I'm not sure about its availability now, but I know I got my copy. Pick it up if you can. A very cool take from a very down-to-earth and relatable dude who did some pretty amazing shit. He released a new song this year called Slide to the Side, collaborating with Chicago production hip-hop legend Maker. Also providing cuts on that record is my brother, DJ Allo. He's also released a remix album on Head Knock Records of some of his classic material. EC is an MC's MC. Some of the greatest to ever do it have given him his props, not only for his abilities, but also for blazing a trail and showing folks how to put out independent albums. Here's a couple of the comments on the back of his book jacket. The legendary Schoolie D said, "Each story reads like a poem. E.C. is a certified Chicago OG." Slug of Atmosphere said, "I was inspired by how this rapper from Chicago, who was releasing his own music, could find a way into the racks of a record store in my neighborhood. In my opinion, he's part of the pavement for many of us who chose to take the independent path. Flowers for E.C. Illa." Vinny Paz of Jedi Mind Tricks, "E.C.'s indie approach was a huge influence to me and what I am still doing today." Nowadays, it's crazy because there are no gatekeepers. You can put out a video and go straight to YouTube. You can put out, an album on CD, baby, and have it stream everywhere, all over the world. Which leads me to kind of ask myself, and these are kind of the questions like, if Larry Bird were to come back and play in the NBA today, would he dominate? In his prime? The answer, of course, is absolutely. He would destroy. But I ask the question then, if E.C. were young and hungry like he was before, in today's environment, what would that look like? And I have to feel like he could take over the world. If he didn't have to worry about getting distribution or funding expensive videos or studio time, I believe that his hustle was tailor-made for the way the game is today, and I think that he would thrive. So those are my thoughts on E.C. Illa, a bona fide Chicago hip-hop legend. And being called a legend in the era that E.C. came up in is no small feat, but I truly think it applies. And one thing about legends, they inspire people through their art. And in my case, E.C. absolutely was an inspiration, not only for me to continue creating the kind of hip-hop music I love, but also to move to the city that became my home. I love the city of Chicago. I love Chicago hip-hop, and I love all the friends I've made being involved in Chicago hip-hop. I cherish my happy little hip-hop memories, and I can draw a direct correlation between those experiences and seeing E.C.'s On Ill video for the very first time that afternoon on Rap City. So as always, this is Mark G saying, be good to each other. We need a little bit more of that in the world these days. And until next time, peace.
If you love hip-hop, it's to all the real MCs. Come on. If you love hip-hop, it's to all the real MCs. Come on. Come on. If you love hip-hop, it's to all the real MCs. Come on. If you love hip-hop, it's to all the real MCs.